Okay, so welcome to part 4 of the video lecture for this week on the nervous system. Here we really start to talk about the peripheral nervous system. Now, the peripheral nervous system, when we are talking about the peripheral nervous system, we're talking about branches that come off of the central nervous system. And in the brain, we talked about the cranial nerves, right? So we talked about the branches, the cranial nerves that come off of the brain, and those are peripheral nerves. Now we're talking about spinal nerves, and we're talking about branches that come off of the spinal cord. So here I have a spinal cord, and we're seeing this is anterior, this is the body, the vertebral body, and here we're seeing the spinous process. So remember, spinous process is always posterior and the body is always anterior. So this sits toward the belly and this sits toward the back. We have our vertebral arch and we have our spinal cord running right through the middle. Again, we have our spinal nerves that are branching off, and they are sitting in spaces between the vertebrae called the intervertebral foramina. Whoops, I have that kind of upside down. There we go. And normally, of course, we'd have a disc, an intervertebral disc sitting above and below the body of the vertebra. And sometimes they can actually end up being troublemakers because those discs get a lot of wear and tear and they can end up actually sitting right on. So if the disc ends up herniating and squishing backward, it can end up pressing on the spinal nerve. So just kind of keep this in mind as we're talking about the spinal nerves. Okay, so we have branches of spinal nerves. We have 31 pair. We have some of those nerves, we have branches that head left and branches that head right. So the branches on the left serve the left side of the body, branches on the right side of the body. As the book says, and we talked about already, spinal nerves split. So here you're seeing the nerves split, and almost immediately, those spinal nerves split into a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. The dorsal ramus heads toward the back of the body and the ventral ramus heads toward the front. That makes sense, right? Because the body's super efficient. It's not going to have one nerve try to cover everything. It sends branches to take care of that. And that's what they talk about at the bottom of page 306. Now, the other thing that I think is super interesting is that each area, we have these spinal nerves. There are spinal nerves that actually form these specialized networks. And the specialized networks are called plexes. If you're talking about one, it's called a plexus. So on the top of page 307, they talk about plexes, and like I said, I like to think of them as networks of nerves, and they're formed by very specific spinal nerves. So we have, first of all, our very first network is called the cervical plexus, and it is formed from the nerves, or like the spinal nerve roots from C1 to C5. So we have these little, let me make this bigger. Oops, not going to let me make it bigger. There we go. So we see the branches come off of the spinal cord, and immediately they form this little tangled web, this little network. Well, that network has a special name. So this is the cervical plexus, and we have a cervical plexus on the left and a cervical plexus on the right. And so cervical plexus is the first one we talk about. There is a very important nerve that comes off of the cervical plexus, and the name of that nerve is known as the phrenic nerve. it is very important because it innervates our diaphragm that helps us with respiration. So we have our phrenic nerve coming off of that cervical plexus. The second network that happens a little bit lower down and is formed from the branches C5 through T1. So we have little branches coming off, and all of a sudden you see that tangle. This is called the brachial plexus. Again, we brachial plexus to the left, brachial plexus to the right. They're just not showing you the right side. But the brachial plexus is a network that gives rise to all of the nerves that carry strength and sensation to your arms. So very, very important. You will see the brachial plexus on a good page, page 308. And you can see how it gives rise to the major nerves of the arm. So the axillary nerve, and the axillary nerve is, let's see if I can bring a picture of the actual brachial plexus up. There we go. They're showing the lumbar plexus. There we go. We got the brachial plexus. See, we see this, the branches come off, they form this network, and then you can see that the nerves of the arm come off of that network. So we see the first nerve, the axillary nerve. This supplies a very important muscle, the deltoid muscle, as one example. So I'll try to give you one important muscle that each nerve serves. Axillary nerve supplies a deltoid muscle, and that makes sense. The deltoid muscle is sitting right there. We have the musculocutaneous nerve that you're seeing here, and the musculocutaneous nerve supplies your bicep muscle. And again, that makes sense, right? Your bicep sits right here. You have that musculocutaneous nerve carrying messages to your biceps muscle. We have the median nerve, and actually this is the nerve that's involved in carpal tunnel syndrome. So the median nerve comes right down here. A lot of times this nerve can get pressure on it, or it gets trapped, or from people doing a lot of repetitive wrist motion, there can be a lot of swelling in their wrist that causes pressure on this nerve, causing something called carpal tunnel. But the median nerve comes down and it supplies the flexors of the wrist and forearm. So they list all of those muscles on page 309. You don't have to know them all, but one very important sign that the carpal tunnel, that median nerve, is being trapped is a lot of times, because that nerve supplies also some of the muscles in your hand. If you have someone with carpal tunnel on one side, if you look at their two hands together, you'll notice that this area, it's called the thenar eminence, is very, very flat. It has atrophy. The muscles have lost their development because the message that the median nerve is carrying to those muscles is being cut off. So the muscles start to atrophy. So that's the median nerve. We have our ulnar nerve that, not surprisingly, it's on the pinky side of the forearm. And that ulnar nerve supplies some of the flexors that are located on that pinky side, like the flexor carpi ulnaris. And then we have our radial nerve, and our radial nerve is very, very important in serving muscles of the backside of our arm, the posterior aspect. So what muscle sits in the backside of the arm? Do you remember that the triceps sits in the posterior aspect of the arm? So triceps and all of the muscles on the posterior aspect of the arm that help extend our wrist and fingers. So the radial nerve supplies our triceps. And again, all of those nerves arise off of the brachial plexus. And you can see some really good pictures in your lab manual on page 308. Now, as a student, I kind of sat and wondered, why do we have plexes in the first place? Well, the good news is that let's say we have some kind of disc herniation that's sitting on one of these roots, one of these nerve roots that come off the spinal cord. Could you imagine if only one root served one muscle? In many cases, the nerves in our arms come from branches of a couple of different roots. So let's say we do have one root that's getting pressed on by a herniated disc. It doesn't take out the whole muscle. So that nerve will still get a little bit of juice coming out of some of the other nerve roots that go into forming that nerve. And that's a really good thing. So, for example, the axillary nerve comes from both C5 and C6. And remember that axillary nerve supplies our deltoid muscle. So if we have a herniation at C5 and this nerve is getting pressed on, the good news is that the deltoid muscle still gets some juice from C6. It doesn't get completely knocked out. You still have some use of that deltoid muscle. The body, very, very smart design, always has a little plan B, making sure that all the bases are covered. So that's where I think, not that I designed the body, but that's where I think all of these plexes come from, is just making sure that we always have kind of a plan B or something just in case we have injury. We don't lose use of the part of our body so easily. All right, so that's the brachial plexus. And then if you turn to the page 310, and I think this has it. Okay, there's cervical plexus, brachial plexus. We have what is called the lumbar plexus. And the picture of the lumbar plexus, I'm not sure why they have it back here, but we see that lumbar plexus comes from branches of L1 through L5. We see those branches come out. Here's our plexus, and look at all the really cool nerves that come off of that plexus. We see those nerves running down into the leg. So nerves from our lumbar spine give strength and sensation to our legs. The nerves of the cervical spine give strength and sensation to our upper extremities. All right, so now let's look at the lumbar plexus, and let's take a look at some of the nerves that come off of that network. I really am just going to highlight only one major nerve that comes off of that lumbar plexus, and that's the femoral nerve. So the femoral nerve is the nerve that gives strength to our quadriceps muscle and also the sartorius muscle. So the muscles that are in the front part of our thigh. And again, there are other nerves that come off of that plexus, but the femoral is a really big nerve that comes off of that. And last but not least, the sacral plexus. So here we have the sacral plexus, and we're seeing the branches of the sacral plexus. You can see this on page 311 of your lab manual. And we're seeing the branches here, and the sacral plexus, we see L4 to S5, and that plexus gives rise to one of the really major nerves that run down the back of our leg. It's called the sciatic nerve. And the sciatic nerve is the nerve that becomes irritated often in patients that have sciatica. So that nerve comes right down the back, and often patients will have pain or numbness in their gluteal region, their butt cheek, that runs right down the back of their leg. For the sacral plexus, again, that sciatic nerve, really the big part of the sciatic nerve is going to supply the hamstring muscles, which are a big group of muscles in the back of the thigh. Remember, that help extend the hip and bend the knee. And then that sciatic nerve will split. It has a tibial portion and a common fibular portion. And that common fibular portion will serve some of the hamstrings, but then some of the muscles in the lower leg. But just know that the sciatic nerve comes off of the sacral plexus, sacral sciatic. So those are the major plexes that branch off of the spinal cord. Again, we have branches that come off left side, right side, I want to emphasize that for these nerves and these plexes, they're very predictable. So if a patient comes in with certain symptoms, like let's say a patient comes into the clinic and they have pain down the back of their leg, and I test their muscle strength. Let's say their hamstrings on one side are weaker than the other. They have pain going down the back of their leg. They have some sensory changes in that same leg. Because I know that the sciatic nerve is a branch off of the sacral plexus, and that nerve is supposed to supply the hamstrings, I stop and think to myself, hey, I wonder if this person is having some kind of irritation of the sciatic nerve. So all of this is very predictable, what these nerves serve, what they do. And so if a patient comes in with a particular set of symptoms, I can use my knowledge of anatomy and their symptoms to figure out what's going on with the patient. So at this point, what I'd like you to do from here is I'd like you to go back into the course module, and take a look at this, not stretch reflex, brachial plexus video. So take a look at what happens if there is an injury to the brachial plexus. So what is the brachial plexus? We've covered, but what happens if there's injury to the brachial plexus? I'd also like you to take a look at, I'm going to move this up a little bit, this picture of the dermatomes. I'd like you to look up, what is a dermatome? Take a look at the map and kind of color it in and see if you can make sense of it and how we might use it diagnostically in the clinic. How could we use a dermatome diagnostically in the clinic? And then finally, I'd like you to take a look at these last couple of segments. And again, thinking about these segments and how they relate to the spinal cord and spinal nerves. And we'll start off week 2 talking about some of the things you looked up and researched for this week's content. So I hope you all have a great first week. We will be in person for week 2. And if we bring up the calendar, let's see, I'm going to bring that calendar right on up so we can look at it together. So here we are. Classes are going to start on the 19th. So the video that we're doing together, you're going to have this first week to take care of. And then the week of the 25th through the 29th, those of you who are going to be in person, you will actually go to lab. Again, those who are virtual, no problem. We'll have videos of the activities on Canvas. We are going to do a staggered start. So we will be dividing lab sections that are larger into 2 parts, a group A and a group B. So group A will attend the first part of lab. Group B will attend the second part, the second half of lab. And the lab instructors, we will let you know through an announcement what group you're part of and what time you should attend. So keep a lookout for that. And again, bring the information, these assignments that you've completed to the first week of class because we will be spending some time talking about them together. And then if you're online, you will be, you'll see a link to a Zoom meeting. So you will be live with us for the first part of lab. All right. Hopefully you all have a great week and we will see you back week 2.